Welcome back to Road Gang Radio. Join Jimmy Mack and Lindsay Lawler's Gang of the Airwaves by subscribing to Radio Nemo on YouTube.
We celebrate all kinds.
Make it official. After all, if you're listening, you're already in the gang. The Road Gang.
We want to give a big shout out to our friend Scott Cooper, who actually told Dre and I both good morning over on the Tube of You, where he is yakking it up. Scott, we hope you're doing well. Hope you're hanging in there. Your friend Jerry has been by the studio. Maybe it's about time that you and the wife and the boys, and they're no longer boys, by the way. We've been doing this journey for so long, Dre, that there are a number of people like Rod Knopfsinger's son, who I knew when he was a young teenager, who is now a lieutenant and basically an Annapolis graduate and studying nuclear propulsion right now. That's where the world has come to. Scott's sons, who all look alike for a reason, all three of them. I've watched them go from being a bunch of unruly kids to turning into fine young men. Putting together your life over time, most people actually are able to kind of do it, even with their grandparents and their families, because they have a direct line to everything that went on. There is very little disruption. Just to kind of give you an example of how the world can change, my mother and father had to spend over a year kind of reassembling their memories after Katrina. I mean, Dave and Cheryl never got all that Radio Nemo paraphernalia back when Nashville flooded. A simple natural disaster can disrupt the world and actually unmoor you from your past. One single thing can actually disrupt that, even when you have these unbroken continuums. I bring all of this up, by the way. It's a beautiful thing to be able to kind of reconstruct what you've lost, even if the reconstruction of what you've lost is tragedy. That we all should make a habit of, as we've talked to a number of historians on this show who have told people, if there is anyone who is alive who can give you a direct line to who you were and where you came from, you should take full advantage of that, because reconstructing gaps and absences when no one is there anymore is often an amount of heavy lifting. And a certain amount of heavy lifting goes on here in this absolutely wonderful book. I can't talk about this enough. Anne Hand joins us again, and the name of the book is Austrian Again. And we want to welcome her. We want to say good morning to her on this wonderful, beautiful Friday in the city of New Orleans. By the way, she goes back to 85 in New York and currently divides her time between Massachusetts and Mexico City. She's got a Bachelor of Science from McGill University and a Master of Education from Harvard. She has spent her career blending research, policy, and practice to create social impact in the Americas and beyond. She's a recognized expert in global education and development, and she is frequently published on topics related to technology and society. Austrian Again is her first book. Good morning to you, Anne. Welcome to Road Gang Radio.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody listening at home or on the road or wherever y'all are.
Let's just kind of begin really simply. This begins with a headline, and this begins with almost a reconstruction project. So can you kind of talk about that headline and the ignition switch that it sets off that leads us to this book?
Yeah, so I was reading the news one day. It was sort of maybe 6 months into the pandemic. I was at home, and like a lot of us were, right? And there was just that kind of like anxiety, right? That we all kind of felt, not knowing where things were going. And I just remember reading the news one morning and seeing this headline that I was like, huh. Because when we read the news, I mean, we're reading about other people. We're not reading about things that necessarily you think are gonna impact you or be part of your life. So I read this headline that Austria, which it's a small country in Central Europe, it doesn't usually make headlines. They were opening this new restoration citizenship pathway for people whose families had been persecuted during World War II, during the lead up, like in the 1930s, with all of the political and religious persecution, and then in the 40s, with what actually happened during the war. And I knew that, we had some of that history. I knew that my great-grandmother had been fortunate to be able to flee from Vienna, the capital of Austria, in 1938. But nobody had really talked about any of that. Nobody had, passed on the stories of what happened. We just kind of knew high level that, like, yes, like bullet point, this happened, then that happened, and she got out and she was lucky. So yeah, I was curious. I wanted to learn more, and it kind of became this deep dive to reconstruct these family stories that nobody had passed down. And I really appreciate what you were saying kind of a few minutes ago, where these kinds of disruptions, and you just don't know, right? You don't know how things are going to unfold and what's going to happen. And then within that, afterwards, the way that those stories are told or not told, that also, I think, impacts how people move forward and see themselves and everything. So yeah, it was a really, really cool and interesting process, and I'm so glad that I was able to do it.
The other thing, and like I said, we can only relate to the personal and the anecdotal through our own personal anecdotal kind of things. Many years ago, my father got a chance to take his parents back to Ireland. They had never been there.
Mhm.
My mom has people over there. She comes from there, but my dad, they've always been in the U.S. since the 1840s. And he actually got a chance to go back to a little small plot of earth between two very small hamlets, Abbey and Dorney. And he suddenly realized that he was looking at the ground where his people had come from. And to be able in that moment, he said, to see that plot of earth, that poor plot of earth, and to realize where that journey had taken the entire family over the course of many decades, over a century, was overwhelming. Can you kind of talk
Mhm.
about the idea of when you return and as you grapple with the issue of Austrian citizenship, but as you also begin to put things back together, were there moments for you where you had that sense of awe, the idea that, somebody over cover of night literally says, this place is not for me anymore and I have to start the world again to new, but to go back to where it all begins? What kind of impact does that make on you as both a writer and as somebody who is interested in their roots?
I think it's something that you can't really understand until you experience, because it sounds kind of cliche. I think a lot of the time when you have this like overpowering sense of just emotion, like really pure emotion that you hadn't anticipated at all. Because when you're removed from it, you're thousands and thousands of miles away, and it's much more of an idea than like a reality, I guess. um that's you can kind of rationalize it, and you can say like, okay, this is what happened. Here's what I'm finding in the historical record. Here's the documentation. Here's what I'm finding, about cousins from these archives in Austria and Germany and Poland. And so you can kind of like wrap your head around it in a different way. But when you're actually, in the physical space, or you realize that like, oh my gosh, like this is real and this is crazy, and you sort of break down a little bit. And everybody who does this, who has that real deep sense of connection, I think that they feel that, and they feel that in different ways. And for me, it's interesting, I guess, because they had to leave, and they never really went back in any meaningful way. I mean, my a couple of my great aunts went back to see the old family apartment, and some of the neighbors were still there, and this was back in the 1970s, and they had left 30, 40 years before. And that's a very different thing. That was more like, oh, okay, like, you're doing fine, great, we're doing fine. And nobody talked about the war and what
Of
happened,
course.
and how devastating that was for everybody, because it was too much. I think, and at a personal level, if you're just a regular person, you want to keep things okay. You want to keep things moving on, and not dwell if you don't have to. And I think that was kind of my own family's way of dealing with a lot of this, is like, you don't have a choice. You have to pivot. You have to do what you can that's best for you to keep your life moving forward. And it's just not, of course, they thought about it, and I'm sure they felt survivor's guilt, but they didn't transmit those feelings down. So the first time I went to Vienna, I was actually just a tourist. I was there for like a day, and I did all the stuff that you do, in the downtown, and you see the castle, and you see the church, and you see the opera house, and stuff like that. And it was nice. It's a beautiful city, but I didn't feel a kind of personal connection, although I knew my family was from there. It still felt like a tourist kind of thing. But it is like very different now, knowing that my great grandfather is buried in Vienna's Central Cemetery, and knowing where they lived, and knowing what the city's like now, and kind of feeling it out in a different way. And there's not like necessarily a plot of land. I think land and that kind of rootedness to land and to property and all of that, that's just a very different kind of sense of permanence that we all want to have. And then to reconnect with that, it's just incredible. It's so powerful. It's so moving, and it makes you feel like really connected, I think, to this big, circle of humanity in a way that not a lot of things can make us feel these days.
One of the other interesting things too, in regards to the structure of the book, because it is as much it's so many things at once. It is a memoir of a present day event that has happened very recently, but it is also a memoir of the reconstruction of family history through anecdotes and bits and pieces as it goes through. So you're moving forward in the current time, while at the same time having to kind of do these drop downs to kind of go underneath to kind of put the world together around you. And in many ways, while it is while the work is of course focused on you, it becomes a great textbook for a lot of our friends out there who are looking to reconstruct their own family histories. So many of our listeners out there, my father-in-law, the man whom the show is named after, one side of his family is Eastern European, and it is always the one that has been the hardest for him to kind of put back together, because you're dealing with two things in regards to middle century history. Number one, of course, you're dealing with the war and the Holocaust, essentially the evaporation of the existence of so many human lives, both on the battlefield and in far worse conditions than that, all across Eastern Europe. But you're also dealing with generations of people who want to put it behind them. You talk about survivor's guilt, but how many people, in the diaspora that actually ends up leaving Eastern Europe change their names, change their realities? America really is, as Bernard Baelish said, a place to begin the world anew. And there were people who were like, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to hold on to the old traditions. We're going to become part of the United States of amnesia. So can you kind of talk about that as well, the idea of, as you're writing this book, how you decided to make the balance between your own personal journey as you wrestle with Austrian citizenship, but also what to put into the book in regards to what you thought needed to be highlighted from your family. And with the second question is, and I have an idea what they are there any particular things that you discovered that you found profoundly moving or literally stopped you in your tracks?
So I'm going to answer the second question first,
okay,
because that's an easier question in a way, and then I'm going to go back to your first question, and they're both really, really, really great questions. So the one the sort of stopped me in my tracks, like what is this, was when I found a cousin's name on a deportation list. So he was sort of part of the first. So we all know that the whole Nazi extermination campaign, Final Solution, death camps, all of that. It didn't happen overnight. It was a very sort of multi-year process of, building the infrastructure and the apparatus, and then finally, moving to do all of that. And one of the first sort of I guess pilot projects, if you want to call it that, which sounds terrible, but that's really what it was, for how to kind of do this, how to move.
And that's how the Germans thought. I want to make this really clear,
Yeah.
guys. That's how the Germans worked. That was what was so insidious about it, was that it was the literal human version of a lobster boil. They did not literally sweep in and then overnight there were concentration camps. They slowly and methodically, around everybody, the world changed, and before you knew it, you were standing in a strange, awful, dystopian landscape. Sorry about that. I wanted to make sure people were clear on that.
Oh yeah, no, it's a great thing to remind people that this stuff doesn't happen, from one day to the next. It's a process that builds and builds, and if nobody stops it, nobody sort of turns the heat down, it just keeps going. So, what I found was that we had this cousin, and my great grandparents, they both had huge families. My great grandmother, I think, was one of 6. My great grandfather was one of 8. And when I was growing up, we didn't have a lot of cousins. It was just, my grandfather and, his siblings never had kids. So it was just kind of us and our immediate family and a couple of cousins. So, I realized just how big, this extended family had been in Central Europe at the time. And they all just kind of disappeared, and nobody talked about them. Nobody said what happened. And of course, I think, you all kind of assume what the worst, but at the same time, the way that I grew up, the victims were the people, who did suffer, in the death camps and in, the forced labor and all of that. But I never felt like my family was connected to it because I didn't hear the stories, and I didn't have like an anchor, I guess, to place myself within that. And the anchor that I found was a cousin who was deported in kind of the first step of trains, like shipping young men out of Czechoslovakia into occupied Poland. And it was this project called the Nisko Plan, and they didn't have like camps at that point or anything like that. They just sort of shipped them into the middle of nowhere where there was nothing and said, okay, like you guys figure it out. And pretty much everybody either ran away or passed away. And he didn't show up anywhere else in the record. He was just on this train deportation list when he was 17. And I was like, that was what stopped me. And I was just like, are you like, what? Like he was 17, and it's the kind of thing that you're just like, yeah, that stopped me. And that, even now I'm kind of feeling shivers just talking about it a little bit, because it's like, what do you even do? What do you even say, other than know that everybody whose families were connected to this, like even if they didn't talk about it, like the worlds that they inhabited were completely destroyed. And everybody who's a descendant of people who were part of that in some way, we're all still affected and impacted. And we just have to, recognize it, and everybody needs to find their own anchor for how they feel like they're connected to it, even if the stories themselves didn't get passed down. And then your first question, with the book, I think I just wanted to take people along for the ride with me, and I appreciate really, what you're saying. I hope that was transmitted, because it's complicated, and I think that it's hard to kind of know, how to go along for the ride when the ride is sort of like these spokes in different directions, right? And how do you sort of take those spokes and kind of like weave them together into something that people are gonna be able to understand and go along for the ride with you, and hopefully, take whatever out of it that resonates with them, and hopefully, think about their own families and these stories that, they don't know what they are, but maybe they'd be really meaningful now to try to figure out what they are. It's really easy to find a lot of these historical records that, I don't think I knew existed before I started this project. Like I'm not a hobbyist genealogist. I don't, I don't have like a gigantic thing up on Ancestry or anything like that, but a lot of people have already done that. There's so much already out there that you can just kind of, go to the library, go onto Ancestry and like tap into it and just start to dig a little bit and see what you find and see how that relates to the stories that or the stories that you grew up with, and just think about it, right? And think about what it means today.
I want to add something for our listeners out there. Often when we deal with memoirs or the reconstruction of past events, it's a really difficult piece of writing to kind of engage in, because it is the one that people often gravitate towards the first, thinking it's the simplest. But it's got to have a clear entry point, a clear rising action, and then a clear kind of exit point. This one does, okay? Austrian Again does have that, which then allows you to be able to breathe through it with expositional digression. I'm going to call it a digression. I want to call it a side mission, because there are so many people you have to kind of reconstitute, reconstruct, and find. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about the writing too, how difficult is it, you get to know somebody and then you have a gap, how difficult is it to avoid speculating about what they might have thought or what might have happened on the in-between when the records aren't there? Did you struggle with having to make that call as well, because you feel you get to know people, but we really don't, because the past is a science fiction landscape. I mean, there's a point where you go so far back in the past that we wouldn't even recognize the mores and the behaviors. We wouldn't know why men pull their pant leg up before they actually go to sit down in the 40s. I mean, it's all those little things. But how much of this by the time it was done, did you feel like you had a clean, kind of clear understanding of the human beings that you were putting back together?
That's a great question. And actually, earlier versions, they had a lot more speculation. To be perfectly honest, they had
It's a
speculation. They
tough call,
had,
isn't it? It's a tough call. It's a hard call when you start
yeah.
having to cut that stuff too, because you feel like you know them. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, no, no. It is a tough call, and this whole project started out, and this is not a spoiler at all. I mean, the book starts out saying I never thought I'd write a book. So it's, the whole project started out as just like me, I think trying to wrap my head around what this reconstruction process was and what it meant, particularly as the things that I started to find in my own research, they just didn't necessarily align with like the stories I'd been told as a kid. I mean, some of them did, some of them didn't, but it was like trying to wrap my head around like, well, why is this the case, right? And you have to think about these family members, these people who are no longer with us, as people, rather than as like my grandfather or something like that. And it was so fascinating to me, for example, that I was 35. Yeah, I was 35 when I started the project, and in figuring out the ages and kind of what was happening. My great aunt, who was the one who was in charge of basically doing all the paperwork to get her mother and her sister out of Vienna after the Nazis had annexed it. Um, she was 34, and you're thinking like, what would I be doing if this is like, instead of me sitting at home kind of like puzzling through this in my head, like my job was to get my mother out of a very, very bad situation without the technology that we have, without knowing how long it's going to take, without knowing what's going to happen, without being able to call, without being able to like text and do FaceTime and stuff like what would I have been thinking? So I think like it helps to think of these people as people, right? And not these ideas of, like my great aunt, that was my great aunt Valerie, right? I have ideas of great aunt Valerie, but that's different than saying like when she was 34, she had to do this and she was able to do it. And how would I be doing it if I had to do it now? So understanding, these relatives as people and contemporaries in a way. I mean, like you're saying, science fiction, time traveling contemporaries, but like, I think that at the end of the day, we're all people, and when we have to do things that are very, stressful and time constrained and all that, like we don't know how we're going to deal with it until we actually have to do it. So just thinking that she had to go through this when we were basically the same age. I mean, that's a crazy thing to sort of like, not even like, I can't even draw a parallel, just understand like what would I do. So thinking about these caricatures of people as like, and not caricatures, but just like you have your family ideas of like who they were and what they did, but thinking about them as real people sort of navigating these like very uncharted circumstances that are very, very high stakes and very, very stressful, that lends a sense of empathy to everything that they were doing. This was such a inflection point for so many people in terms of their paths and their sense of selves, even if they ended up fine at the end. So the speculation like was certainly there, and then a lot of it just came out through the editing process, because it just didn't it didn't resonate with people. It was like too much in my head. It was like too far from the arc and the storyline itself that people could follow, and that's also part of it too. You have to realize like who you're writing for, and at the beginning I was writing for myself, but as the book evolved and the story evolved and the project evolved, it became less about me writing for myself, because I understood, I think in a much better sense, like what had happened and what was going on. And it became a very different kind of writing. And the purpose of that writing and the goal of that writing is to bring people along with you for the ride, and hope that, whatever they want to pull out of it, they're going to pull out of it, and they're going to run with it, and they're going to do their thing. And my job is to make that accessible. So I think that's sort of how it evolved, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, by the way, guys, and it is accessible and it is profound at the same time. My entry point for it, of course, was the conversations I had to have with my great aunt about simply leaving the city of New Orleans right before Katrina hit. And had she not walked out of that city, had she stayed in her home, the 13 feet of water that ended up racing through the breach was less than 5 blocks from her home. And even then, then, Anne, she was deeply resentful that she had to leave her stuff behind, even though it all got destroyed. Deeply resentful of that. And I kept saying to myself, people say, well, why don't you just leave? And the number of people who say stuff like, why didn't they just leave? It's your life. Mm-hmm. You are literally grounded there. You have built an entire life. You look around the world, and it's a world that you have built, and it is a very difficult thing to simply leave that world behind, no matter what is coming for you, because you have to go off into terra incognita, that place that we don't know. Mm-hmm. And we are so thrilled that you could join us this morning. We are out of time. I wanted to make sure I gave you some time, along with being able to find Anne over on X. Is there any other places you want to send people in regards to social media?
Yeah, so I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn and Blue Sky. So any of those, I'm there. I'm posting stuff about the book and what we're doing and events and things like that. Some of the events are in person, some of them are virtual. And the book's available on Amazon and bookshop.org and Barnes and Noble. So that's the easiest way to get your hands on it. Just order it. If you want to support your local bookstores, definitely go with Bookshop. And, I'm just so, excited and humbled by, the response that this is getting, by people, just talking to me about their own families, like we're just chatting right now, and being really, let into these worlds in conversation. It's such a privilege. So just thank you so much. And I hope everybody likes the book.
I know it's your first one. I hope it's not your last. If you get something else done that you want to share with me and my listeners, we would love to have you back. Thank you so much, Anne, for making the time.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody listening.
Anne Hand, of course, we are thrilled to have her here. You can find her on X, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on all the newfangled technologies, by the way. The name of the book is Austrian Again.